It's Threadripper embargo lift day for performance stuff. After hours and hours and hours of testing, I can now make you this low energy video. Not to be confused with the energy consumption though of Threadripper. We're gonna talk about it. The Kraken series AIOs from NZXT come in many shapes and sizes to fit your CPU needs. The Kraken Elite series RGB coolers feature a 2.36-inch 640 by 640 customizable LCD screen, showing system info or custom GIFs and images for a custom look, as well as the F-series RGB fans and a single breakout cable for a simplified installation. If low-key is more your thing, then the Kraken Elite series also comes in black and non-RGB edition, while retaining the amazing pump screen, and NZXT is now enabling animated GIF functionality on all base model non-Elite Krakens. To see the full lineup of the new Kraken and Kraken Elite coolers from NZXT, follow the link in the description below. Okay, so today we're going to be talking specifically about the 7980X. This is the new Threadripper HPDT or high performance desktop monster that AMD has launched because apparently somewhere along the line they were given a memo that says, hey, people still want HPDT processors. And they were like, cool, here's a $5,000 one. Yeah, spoiler alert, I just spoiled it. $5,000 for this. And this isn't even a Pro Series CPU. There's also the 7970X CPU, which we'll be taking a look at in a separate video, that is essentially shaved, like everything is half of what the 7980X is, but it's more than half the price at $3,000. So we're kind of curious to see how that one stacks up, considering the fact that it's half of everything, so it better give you more than half the performance, otherwise that price is really skewed. Specs wise though, you guys have probably seen this a million times. Its single boost clock is up to 5.1 gigahertz. So compared to like its mainstream desktop brethren, if you will, the 7950X is what we're comparing it to today, as well as Intel's 14900K. So we're kind of throwing this against its top competitor, like the top tiers of Intel and AMD's own mainstream desktop stuff. 64 megabytes of L2 cache. It's a 5 nanometer FinFET process. 64 core, 128 threads with a base clock of 3.2 gigahertz and 256 megabytes of L3 cache. Unlocked for overclocking? Yes! Also coming very soon with some fun stuff to talk about here. 350 watt TDP. Now that is like the base clock stuff and all that. Once you enable PBO and all that, you better have some cooling in mind. We'll also give you a sneak peek of that today as well. So speaking of the motherboard, the one that we were using here was actually an Asus, like a workstation board. It's actually workstation, a Sage or Pro Sage Wi-Fi. It's got one DIMM slot per channel for a total support of 1 terabyte of memory. They're also RDIMM, registered RDIMM, so you're not gonna be able to just take normal DDR5 off the shelf and just plop it in here. It's basically using like a workstation slash server grade type of RAM. So that's where some of the crossover from it being HPDT slash professional kind of intersects right there. Whereas in the past, Threadripper type stuff, like the older 3000, 2000, 1000 stuff was able to use just DDR4 off the shelf, any DDR4. So that's gonna be an extra cost. Because the board we're using has one slot per channel, one DIMM slot per channel means we had 4 32 gigabyte sticks for a total of 128 gigabytes of RAM, which might seem like a lot, but when it supports up to 1 terabyte and the fact that you have 128 threads here, and virtualization support and all that, if you're doing VMs or virtual machines, you would want a lot of RAM because you could run a lot of VMs off of this type of see, that's the thing. Like the use case for this is so weird. It's such a weird cross intersect of professional needs and home needs. It says on here it supports up to 5200 MTs. Also, we were actually running 6000 and 6400s actually works and supported on that board. The RDIMMs we were sent were 6400 megahertz. They work. We ran at 6000 because our 7950X CPU that we're using does not like to run 6400 megahertz. So we made sure on our 14900K and our 7950X are running 6000 as well as Threadripper, so there's a level playing field when it comes to the RAM. PCIe lanes, there's 92 of them total, 88 of them are usable. 48 of those 88 are PCIe Gen 5. So your NVMe drive and your graphics card or whatever that are PCIe Gen 5 will have up to 48 lanes available to it. That's also where you're gonna find a huge difference between mainstream desktop CPUs and pro grade slash. It's funny how this is considered like the lowest tier of Threadripper because there's like Epic, which is like server, and then you got Pro, which is like workstation, and then you got this little $5,000 CPU, you know, that is like normal plebeian type CPU as far as this stuff goes, I guess. But again, considering the fact that the Pro can cost $12,000, I guess $5,000 is a steal. You could buy 2 of these and a 4090 for the price of one of those. Before I show you the charts, let's talk about the first boot. The first boot, what's that all about, eh? The first boot takes 15 minutes, maybe thereabouts, and that's because so code 15 is the most common code you'll see on any AMD 7000 series, AM5/TRX5 now. 15 means it's training the memory. And with context restore and all that stuff enabled, and it trains every time, it takes a while to train 128 gigabytes of memory. 15 minutes is what it took for us. Anytime we would make some sort of a memory change, speeds or CPU overclocking or anything playing with that, it has to go through and retrain. 15 minutes. Imagine if it was a terabyte, how long that would take. It got to the point to where I honestly thought the system hung until I just happened to be getting ready to power cycle the power switch, and I noticed the Q code reader cycle real quick to a new number, and then my amber light, which was stuck on, went to a red light, and I went, oh, that's not good. And then it recycled again and went to a white light, and then started the process all over again. Now I went, oh, it is actually doing something. Anyway, once it booted, it was actually pretty solid, pretty stable, until I noticed, I happened to look at my NZXT cooler, and we are using an Asetek 360 regular AIO you'd find off the shelf, because all the CPUs come with an Asetek bracket. All the Threadrippers always have, from the beginning of Threadripper's existence, come with an Asetek bracket. The problem with this particular cooler is the fact that if you compare the cooler area size to the size of the die, you're getting like maybe 60% or less coverage of the actual IHS being touched by the cooler. And if you use the pre-applied thermal paste that's on there, that dot does not really spread. So I ended up applying my own thermal paste on there, which is Kingpin KPX Extreme. Built the system in this nice 011 Dynamic XL, or the Dynamic 011 XL, which looks really nice. And using the NZXT Kraken 360, I went, well, I want to put some pretty fans on there to Lee and Lee. So I put the fans on there for the SL V2s, right, which are the uni fans. What I didn't notice was that with those fans connected to the control box for the uni fans, even though I had the motherboard like fan signal wire plugged into the motherboard, it was turning the fans at like 50 RPM. If I barely touched a fan, they would stop turning. So what was happening is the whole time it was sitting there training and doing this over and over and over, and then sitting in the BIOS, the screen on the pump shows me liquid temp by default. Without cam installed or anything, it works and it will show you liquid temp. That's its default, it's kind of awesome. You don't even need cam running to have it work and do its thing. I happen to look over and see 68 degrees Celsius on the fluid. For those of you that are not aware when it comes to water cooling, 30 to 35 C at the most is normal. There's a misconception out there that goes, if your CPU is running 70 C, then your fluid will be 70 C. No, that is not true whatsoever. Your fluid is always much, 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 much cooler than the part itself. When I saw 68 C, I went, what the heck? And I touched the tubes and they were freaking hot. Like kitchen water sink hot faucets turned on level of hot. I touched the rad and I felt like I got burned. I was like, what the actual F is happening? Then I realized the fans weren't turning. I went, is the pump turning? And I went, the pump has to be turning because it's cycling the fluid through the radiator, which is why the radiator would be so hot. Otherwise you'd have heat focused at the CPU and then some radiant heat make it to the rad. So it's not a Threadripper problem, but it shows you with that control box not spinning up the fans like it was supposed to. What I did during the installation process is I took some extra fans and plopped them on the top of the case, plugged those into the motherboard, had it pulling air through the rad, and then the temp dropped really quickly. It's a Lee and Lee problem where that box was not going full speed, which would be a severe problem had I not caught that. So I was very concerned about those temps. That wouldn't have been a thing if I'd used the NZXT fans plugged into the motherboard through a splitter like it's intended to go. That was just a weird nuance I learned about the Lee and Lee stuff, because normally you could let an AIO sit there with no fans turning at all and have absolutely no problem with passive radiating heat through the radiator with a tiny little guy like an AM5 CPU or an Intel CPU, and it would be just fine. The amount of watts this thing was pulling, because remember when you're in the BIOS, it goes to its max clock speed, which is going to be whatever it is for all core. And this guy was 3.7 gigahertz all core. It was sitting in the BIOS at 3.7 gigahertz all core, just pumping that heat through the system. So that was my first indicator, like there is a real likelihood for some temp fun, if you will, with this guy. I love cooling CPUs and I love the challenge, and challenge accepted. So anyway, I just wanted to tell that quick story so you guys could realize cooling is important. So anyway, moving on, we'll talk about cooling and we'll show you in a sec live. Let's talk about performance. I know that's what you guys care about. So we're gonna talk about our CPU tests first. Can't decide between performance or noise optimization for your next PC case? Then Be Quiet has you covered with their new Dark-Base Pro 901. The interchangeable top and front cover allow you to choose either maximum airflow or virtually inaudible operation. Fan brackets with integrated hubs and pogo connectors make cable management easier than it's ever been, while the touch-sensitive front I/O panel provides state-of-the-art operation. To see the full list of specs of the Be Quiet Dark-Base Pro 901, see our full breakdown video at the link in the description below. Let's start with Cinebench R24. R24 is a new, that chart just immediately is hilarious. So Cinebench R24 is the newest Cinebench that came out, specifically designed for newer, more higher core count CPUs. And it's actually a varying load test, whereas Cinebench R23 is just like, hits the CPU as hard as it can and just pile drives it till the end of the test. R24 actually ramps up and down and does all sorts of multi-threading type stuff to really push modern CPUs. As you can see right here, 5,466 multi-core versus the 7950X's 2104 versus the 14900K's 2278. When it comes to the single core though, this is where the up to 5.1 really kind of shows its ugly head. Both the 7950X and the 14900K will up to single core a much higher single core clock speed, and although the 7950X and the 7980X are on the same Zen 4 architecture, the single core clock speed is much higher in a 7950X than a 7980X. And then the 14900K, the same thing. So that's why you're seeing the single core lower performance out of the Threadripper, because of the fact that it is only up to 5.1 versus Threadripper's like 5.85 or whatever it is. Obviously the 14900K is up to 6 gigahertz. And we were seeing 6 gigahertz, so that's why the score is so much higher. But when we go to Cinebench R23, that's just a test I love. We've been running this test for a long time. It's just fun. I remember the first time I hit 10,000 in Cinebench R23. I was like, yes, this is so cool. Hello, 93,039. Stock settings, mind you. We have not enabled PBO or done anything other than 6,000 megahertz RAM, which does not affect the Cinebench test at all. RAM is not even a factor when it comes to this test. So 93,039 versus the 7950X is very respectable 38,790. So like 40,000 was like the new hurdle, like cross 40,000 and it's like, yeah, it's such a strong CPU. More than double that right here. 14900K is 39,456. But again, the single core story is exactly the same. It's a 1941 versus a 2012 and a 2290 between its mainstream desktop brethren. So as you can see, in highly multi-threaded applications, something like Threadripper absolutely flexes its muscle. It's like that dude at the gym that's just like, you gonna use that? Hey bro, can I get in? So this is Blender Benchmark. It's another free benchmark. And I forgot to mention, these benchmarks we use are all free. So if you want to compare results, download them and be our guest. You can compare at home for free. This is Blender Benchmark. It uses Monster, Junk Shop, and Classroom, which are just 3 like ray trace scenes that it basically just kind of like Cinebench just goes and then it like very noisily denoises the scene and bounces all the rays and puts together an image. You don't get to see the image, it happens just in the background, but you get to see the results. 704.93 samples per minute with Threadripper. Clearly a simultaneous multi-threading monster when it comes to the performance, because we're comparing it to a 256.96 for 7950X and a 259.21 for 14900K. Actually, these are very close together. I had no idea they were actually that close. So moving on now to Junk Shop, it's a harder scene, so it takes a little bit longer. It's 490 samples per minute versus 177 and 163. These should be no surprise on the charts because of the amount of threads there are in there. And then Classroom, an even harder test, 356 samples per minute to 134 and 121. The last thing we want to talk about here is Geekbench. Geekbench is another free suite. It just sort of does all sorts of random sampling of the CPU. It's not just like one really hard multi-threaded task. It does all sorts of things to sort of test overall general use of the CPU, not just a benchmark to be like, what's the hardest task we could throw at it? It's just a bunch of random tasks. So here's how that looks here. And it also does a multi-core and a single core. So the pink line is our multi-core. So we got 26,586. The 7950X didn't fare as well against the 14900K as it did in the other test, but 20,226 versus a 22,025. The gap here is not as big as I expected it to be. And the reason for that is because it's not just one multi-core test and one single core test. It's a bunch of them. Okay, gaming though. TimeSpy normal. We like TimeSpy. It's an older test. If we're looking for CPU bottlenecks, we want to throw as many frames at the CPU as possible with the highest end GPU we can. So we ran a Founders Edition 4090 with 100% fan speed so that we could keep the temps as low as possible and the boost bins as high as possible, which would mean the only thing affecting its performance is the CPU itself. So here's how this looks. Yeah, do you see this right here? So we got three things happening here. I'm sorry, AM5, you fell over there. It was also like, oh, it saw these results and it's like, it can't be. So we think something's really not right with 3D Mark currently, especially TimeSpy. Looking at the reviewer guide that came from AMD, there's no 3D Mark type stuff on there except for one particular test I've never run before. No Port Royal, no TimeSpy, no Firestrike, no any of that stuff. So as you can see with the 7950X and the 14900K, the combined score is as expected. And we took the same GPU and moved it between systems, by the way. So there's no GPU variance here of saying two different FEs can have different boost tables and ASIC quality. This is the same GPU that got moved between all three systems. So a 36,087 on Intel's versus 32,059 versus an 11,578 on the 7980X. Now this, I don't think is any fault of Threadripper. I think it's gonna take time for the 3D Mark suite and the hardware monitor stuff that it does in the background to formulate the test for the CPU. I think it needs to be updated for this CPU. We saw this with previous Threadrippers and Xeon processors and high core count processors. So this isn't abnormal. I just was looking at this going, that's odd. So we installed, obviously Ryzen Master. We tried game mode. Anytime we enabled game mode and would turn off SMT, the system would not post, period, wouldn't post. Because we couldn't get that to work, this is the results as they are for this particular test. Not surprising though, as we look at games, you're gonna see this is not a gaming platform whatsoever. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, an old title, specifically because of the fact we are looking for CPU bottlenecks. So we want an older title that we can push a lot of frames at. So Shadow of the Tomb Raider was set to 1440p high settings, no ray tracing or anything. The 7980X had the least FPS at 233 versus 31 FPS more on the 7950X at 264 average FPS. And then another like 20 something FPS higher than that, or almost like 17 FPS higher than that. So 17 FPS higher than that on the 14900K at 281. But what you'll notice here is the blue bar represents the amount of GPU bound that we are. So the higher your GPU bound means the more the GPU is not waiting on the CPU. So the less GPU bound you are, the more the GPU is waiting on the CPU. So as you can see with the 7980X, it was 0% GPU bound, which tells us it was 100% waiting on the CPU. The GPU was probably running very cool and barely breaking a sweat. The 7950X was 9% GPU bound. So same thing, not that abnormal. And the reason is we intentionally put a bottleneck in here. So if we were to run this at like ultra settings or like 4K, it'd be a 99% GPU bound, which is ideal. We artificially create a bottleneck here to compare. The 14900K at 31%. So as you can see, even at 281 FPS, 31% bound, the 14900K was also waiting, or the 4090 was also waiting on the 14900K. That's to be expected. This many cores, this many CCXs, 8 of them, and game mode, whatever that's supposed to do, not working. This seems like you would be leaving performance on the table with just that many cores going on. Not to mention, remember when I said up to 5.1 on only a single core, on average, these were running down to like the high 3000s, low 4000s doing its thing. So it's like a gigahertz disadvantage versus the mainstream processors as well. So what happens when you go to Cyberpunk? They don't show bound on this, but it's the same sort of story. 7980X at 141, 7950X at 164, and a 14900 at 177. And notice it, yes, this is the X and not the X3D. Should probably mention that right at the beginning. That's because I firmly believe the 7950X is a more well-rounded CPU that is great at multitasking, as well as giving you good gaming performance without having the niche of being like, I've got one CCD that is designed for 3D V cache and one CCD that's designed to do stuff, and we hope the scheduler assigns it correctly, which is my experience in the past. I feel like it's the better Mario CPU, if you will. So that is what those results look like. It's really nice to see that HPDT is making a comeback. A lot of people were upset that I didn't wait to put Threadripper in Skunkworks when it first came out, but I knew the way this story was gonna go because we've seen it before. It is a great CPU for workstation rendering, virtualization, VMs, servers, home servers, whatever. There's so many use cases for it that if a lot of cores is what you need, then perfect. Here's a stupid little analogy for you. When it comes to threads count, or 128 of them in this instance, if you wanted to get a lot of stuff from A to B, would you rather have a yacht or would you rather have a container ship? Threadripper's a container ship, and it's gonna get there a little bit after the yacht, but it's gonna bring everything with it. Okay, that's exactly what Threadripper does. But I want to show you something else that Threadripper does. So remember how I talked about having to overcome the problem with the fans? So this was just the Lee & Lee fans I had to plop on top to pull air through. There's a liquid temp currently at 28, which is very normal. Like I said, that said 68 degrees. Hey, it came down. That said 68 degrees and touching the tubes and ow. And the rad was very hot. I should have taken a thermal image of it. It would have said 68 like everything else, like the fluid. But Precision Boost Overdrive is AMD's built-in to Ryzen Master, technically, and the motherboard, but it's its built-in auto overclocking feature. By default, the 93,000 run was a 350 watt TDP, like a packaged TDP. And I'm gonna report right now, even though the Asetek CPU block coverage is terrible versus Threadripper, AMD has done something magical under that IHS. Whether it is directly soldered and not just a solder TIM, but like a real solder that is touching the IO die, which is in the center, and all the CCXs around it. It was able to keep at 350 watts the CPU in the mid 70s on the package and the upper 60s, low 70s per CCX. That was nuts to us. We expected at 350 it was gonna hit 95 watts, which is the factory TDP for the CPU. So that 350 watts though, they recommended a 1,000 watt power supply for factory type settings. They said if you're gonna overclock and you're gonna put a high-end GPU, i.e. a 4090 or like a 7900X TX, we recommend a 1600 watt. So I have got a Be Quiet 1600 watt with a switchable 12 volt rail that I have switched to a single 12 volt instead of a multi-rail. And I have enabled PBO, which now gives us a PPT or limit of 2,000 watts. No, it's not gonna hit that. That's just theoretically a number it'll never hit. You wanna see how much? Check this out. I am going to go ahead and hit start on the multi-core. You're gonna see the temp immediately hit 95. 701 watts, 645, 562. It's throttling down now because it's at 95 watts. With a score of a 106,811. Let's do that again, shall we? 720 watts. I feel like Doc Brown in 1.21 gigawatts. How could I have been so careless? Actually, what I'm gonna be doing is a full custom loop for this, because what I have is this guy right here. I have an EK Quantum Magnitude TR4 block. Yes, TR4 coolers will work with TR5, obviously, because that's what's attached and that's what they even said to use. I'm doing a full custom water loop on this because I want to see how far I can push it. And AMD did say to be prepared for 830 watts worth of thermal draw, or TDP, if you get the clock speeds up. Well, I'm curious now, what does the all-core go to? Probably a spike and then come down because of that power or that thermal limit. 4.7 all-core, 4.5, 4.4, 4.3, 4.2. I'm still, there's 110,438. 110,438. If only I didn't suck at gaming. So 110,000, a new record for us. 107 was the best prior to this during our testing, but we only started to begin to mess around with PBO and all that. Let's go ahead and, I guess, talk about the watts, because initially 350 watts sounds ridiculous. And at stock speeds, 350 watts was staying in like I said, the 70s. It's a 95C TDP or thermal limit. So we weren't getting anywhere near there, which means our 3.7 gigahertz all core was auto overclocking to 4.7 and then dropped down to 4.2 or whatever it was by the end of the test. I'm shocked that Asetek was able to do as well as it was without touching every square millimeter of the die, the IHS. The best way to cool a CPU is to touch the entire IHS, because any heat not being picked up from there is just thermal saturation that doesn't need to be there. But initially I was like, dang, these watts are ridiculous, but it's really not that far off from like a 13900K or 14900K with any of like Asus motherboards or any other motherboard with like Intel limits removed. In fact, we've seen 360 watts on a 13th gen and a 14th gen CPU out of the box, because most of the motherboard manufacturers ship those motherboards with those limits disabled. So the fact that 350 watts is not efficient in terms of like saying the amount of power draw, but performance per watt is just magical with AMD. If you think about the amount of performance we're getting for that wattage, at 93,000 Cinebench score, at roughly the same wattage draw as the 40,000 performance score of the 14900K. Because to get a 14900K to 40,000 and above, you have to overclock it and allow 320 watts. That's only 30 watts difference, 320 to 350, when you're going from a 24 thread CPU to a 128 thread CPU. So the performance per watt on Threadripper is nothing short of amazing. This is where I need you guys to sound off. Who needs that many threads? Like, I know I'm starting to sound like old man yells at cloud, but I am, for the life of me, because of the sacrifice to gaming performance, I cannot see this being like gamers eating this up. No way whatsoever. Unless we were gonna do like a, I don't know, multi-gamer single system a la Linus type of thing, I can't imagine that being useful to anybody in terms of gaming. I can see it being useful to people running, like I've said multiple times, virtual machines, home servers, or whatever else, and slicing up those cores into a bunch of VMs on the same box. That's the only way I could see it being useful. Or somebody that is doing, this sound off below. This is where I need you to tell me what other use cases in the workloads you guys are doing at home where you would need a CPU like this outside of a professional environment. If that professional environment is in your home, what are you doing that you need it for? Because I'm genuinely curious. Anyway, if you're curious about how we're gonna tame the thermals at that 720 and up to 830 watts of power draw for overclocking, make sure you guys are subscribed and stay tuned, because that's the next thing we're gonna do. I'm gonna do a custom water loop in that system, multiple radiators to see with full coverage die or block touching that IHS, how much better will the thermals be and how much more headroom can we get? I'd love to see 4.7 all core and stay there, like not have it thermal throttle down. All right guys, thanks for watching. As always, we'll see you in the next one.